After a rather accidental discovery, mashing cocoa beans and boiling them out of a strange idea, I came up with one evening like a madman. I found myself standing on the edge of something entirely new. A chocolate house. A drink, like it had never been introduced here. Not in this way. Not as something meant to be sat with, enjoyed, and returned to. It was not bread, not wine, not coffee. It was something else entirely. I had always had a craving for sweets, baked goods, and hard candies, but even those began to feel predictable over time. I wanted something more refined, something that could hold attention the way coffee did, something people would come back for without quite knowing why. A drink that felt different the moment it was placed in your hands. At first, the idea felt unreasonable. The mixture was thicker than anything most would consider a drink, richer in both scent and taste, and entirely unfamiliar to anyone I spoke to about it. I found myself wondering whether people would appreciate it or simply laugh at the thought of it. Still, the idea would not leave me. It was a spring when I began construction on the chocolate house, and from the first day I stepped into the space, the excitement never settled. I worked through mornings and into evenings, shaping the room into something that felt deliberate, something that suggested this was not just a place to stop, but a place to remain. The tables were placed carefully, not too close, not too far, each one set so conversation could exist without effort. The fire was built to hold steady heat, not just for the work, but for the comfort of anyone who entered. I wanted the room to feel warm before the drink was ever placed in their hands. I spent as much time outside as I did within it, not working with the chocolate, but with the idea itself. I walked the streets with notices in hand, placing them where they would be seen, near the markets, along the paths servants used each morning, and outside the homes of those who had the means to indulge in something new. I wrote invitations where it mattered most, sealed them, and had them delivered to doors that did not open for just anything. A one-of-a-kind experience. That was how I described it. Not too much, just enough. In the weeks that followed, I found myself returning to the shop before I needed to, adjusting things that had already been set, moving cups, shifting tables, standing near the fire as though it might tell me whether I had done enough. There is a point where preparation no longer helps, and I had reached it more than once. Still, I continued. The day I chose to open came with a snowstorm. Not light snowfall, not something passing, but a steady fall that began before dawn and showed no sign of stopping as the morning settled in. By the time I stood near the window, watching it gather across the street, the stone had already begun to disappear beneath it. It would have been easy to wait, to delay the opening, to choose a day where the streets were full and the weather worked in my favor. I considered it more than once as I stood there, watching the snow fall without interruption. But I had not built something like this to wait for the right moment. I had built it to begin. The fire was already burning. The chocolate had already been prepared. The room stood ready in a way that would not improve by standing empty for another day. So I opened the door. The cold moved in briefly before the warmth took hold again. the scent of chocolate filling the space in a way I had not yet grown used to. Outside, the snow continued to fall, quieting the street in a way that made the world feel smaller, more contained. I stepped back behind the counter, and for the first time since the idea had begun, there was nothing left to do but wait. The morning I opened, the snow had already begun to fall. It was a brisk winter morning, the kind that made every stone street feel colder than it looked, and every breath seemed sharper the moment it met the air. I had risen early to make sure the room was warm long before anyone ever stepped inside. The fire had been my first concern. I fed it well before dawn, building the heat until it settled into the walls and floorboards and turned the whole room into something inviting, something that felt separate from the cold outside. By the time the chocolate had been warmed and the cups arranged, the shop no longer felt like a new idea waiting to be tested. It felt ready. When I finally opened the door, the real work began. Waiting. I took my place behind the counter with a cup of chocolate in one hand and one of my favorite books in the other, though I could not say I truly read much of it. My eyes drifted more often to the window than the page, following the steady fall of snow as it gathered itself along the street. It was a soft, heavy snow, falling without wind, without hurry, just quietly claiming the day a little more with every passing minute. There was something calming in that first stretch of silence. The fire held steady. The room smelled rich and sweet, with the warm depth of the chocolate settling into the wood and stone as though it had always belonged there. It was too early to know how the day would go, and early enough still that I allowed myself a bit of hope without yet giving way to doubt. As I sat there, I found myself thinking back to the first time I had ever encountered the cocoa bean, and how impossible it would have sounded then that I would one day build an entire house around it. It had not happened in any grand or noble way. I had not discovered it through scholarship or invitation, but by travel, chance, and the sort of curiosity that has always led me into trouble before leading me into fortune. I had been younger then, and far more willing to follow the promise of trade routes simply because they led somewhere unfamiliar. I spent the better part of 2 years moving with merchants, port to port, road to road, learning less from what I was meant to be selling than from what I found in the hands of others. There are things a man remembers from travel, not because they were important at the time, but because they return to him later with greater weight. Cocoa had been one of those things. The first drink I tasted had been crude compared to what I now served. Bitter, thicker than expected, and unlike anything I had ever been given before. It was not pleasant in the way wine could be pleasant, nor familiar in the way coffee was beginning to become familiar in certain circles. But it held something else, something rich, something layered, something that seemed to demand thought the longer it remained on the tongue. That stayed with me. I remember watching the beans themselves more than the drink. Their color, the scent when crushed, the change they took under heat. I remember asking too many questions and getting too few answers, then spending months afterward trying to work out for myself what could be done with them if one had enough patience. It became less a curiosity and more an irritation, one of those ideas that refuses to leave simply because it has not yet been fully understood. By the time I returned to France, I had already begun imagining what it might become. Not simply a drink sold in private to the wealthy as some novelty, but a place built around it. A room where people might sit with it, speak over it, return for it. Something sweeter than what I had first tasted. Warmer in every sense. Softened and refined into something more inviting. That thought had followed me all the way home. And from that point onward, I had been too far gone to do anything but pursue it. The hours passed slowly at first. I read a little, drank a little, and listened to the soft hush of snowfall against the outside world. By midday, the street had grown quieter beneath the gathering white, though I told myself that this was not entirely a bad thing. A cold day made warm things more tempting, and surely there would be someone before long willing to step inside simply for the comfort of the fire. It was sometime in the middle of the afternoon when the door opened without warning and a little girl hurried in ahead of her father, bringing with her a burst of cold air and a voice bright enough to fill the whole room in an instant. She stopped just inside the door, lifted her head, and declared with complete certainty that it smelled sweet in here, as if she had discovered something meant entirely for her. Her father followed close behind, apologizing before he had fully crossed the threshold, though he looked more tired than troubled. He had clearly been in pursuit of her from the street, and the snow on his coat had not yet melted when she had already begun asking what I served and whether she might have some. I told him he was welcome to warm himself by the fire while I prepared a cup, and the girl answered before he could, insisting with such confidence that I nearly laughed. I made one cup first, intending it for her father to taste. He took it with the caution of a man who expected to be disappointed by something too fashionable to be worthwhile. The little girl, meanwhile, watched as though I were handing over treasure. He drank, paused, and then drank again, slower the second time, looking down into the cup as though the answer to some private question had been waiting there all along. The girl was thrilled before he ever said a word. She had already decided by scent alone that it must be wonderful, and once her father allowed her a taste, the matter was settled entirely. Whatever errand had brought them out into the snow in the first place no longer seemed half so important. They stayed only a short while, long enough to warm themselves and finish what I had served. But when they left, the girl went out, singing the praises of the chocolate cup she had just had, loud enough that I could still hear her from the street after the door closed. That did more for my confidence than any printed notice or carefully sealed invitation ever had. I found myself smiling as I returned to the counter. It was not difficult to imagine how the place might grow from there, and my thoughts immediately turned to what I could add in time. Baked goods, certainly. Small things at first. Biscuits, perhaps, or delicate pastries that would pair well with the drink. I even found myself wondering whether there might be something made to soften in the heat of the chocolate itself, something sweet that could be dipped or dropped in and left to melt into it. By then, the snow had begun to pile more seriously along the edges of the street. What had started as a quiet fall now carried the weight of a real storm underway, not violent, not wild, but steady enough that the world beyond the window was beginning to disappear beneath it. By late afternoon, the snow had begun to settle in a way that made the day feel as though it might end earlier than expected. It gathered along the edges of the street and rose slowly against the doors and windows, softening the world outside into something quieter, more distant. I stood near the counter for a time, watching it build, wondering whether it would be wiser to close before the evening set in fully. It would have been reasonable. With the snow falling as it was, most would choose to remain home, near their own fires, rather than venture out into the cold for something unfamiliar. I found myself considering it more seriously than before, looking around the room, weighing the warmth within it against the silence beyond the door. Perhaps this was not the day for it. I moved toward the door, not yet to close it, but to see the street once more before deciding. And that was when it happened. The door opened before I reached it. A group of gentlemen stepped in from the storm, their coats marked with snow, their presence filling the room in a way that felt entirely different from those who had come before. They carried themselves with ease, with the kind of quiet confidence that needed no introduction, though one of them spoke almost immediately, his voice carrying just enough to reach the others. "Yes, this is the place," he said, glancing around the room as though confirming something he had already decided. The girl was speaking of it in the street, a shop that serves chocolate in a cup. I could not believe what I had heard. A few of the others laughed softly, though not dismissively. "And so you brought us all to see it," one of them said. "I said I would investigate the matter," he replied. "You chose to follow." They seemed to agree, though more from curiosity than anything else, their attention already shifting toward the fire, the scent, the cups arranged along the counter. One by one, they removed their gloves and stepped further into the room, their interest no longer casual, but focused. I moved back behind the counter. "How many?" I asked. "All of us," the first man said, without hesitation. I began to prepare the drinks. There was no need to rush, though I worked steadily, the rhythm returning as it had before, each cup filled and carried across with the same care as the last. They took them without ceremony, settling into the seats near the fire, the warmth reaching them quickly after the cold outside. At first, they were silent. Each one held the cup, observing it in the same way I had seen others do, measuring something they could not yet name. Then came the first taste, followed by the same pause I had come to expect. Then another, and another. One of them leaned back slightly, looking into the cup as though reconsidering it entirely. "This is," he began, though he did not finish the thought. Another laughed, softer this time. "No, say it," he said. "It is not what you expected." "It is better," the first replied. That was enough. The room began to shift. What had started as quiet observation gave way to conversation, first between two of them, then across the group, then outward as their voices carried more freely through the space. There was no restraint in it now, no careful measure, only interest, and then enjoyment, and then something closer to excitement. They rose for more without asking. I poured again, and again. The sound of their voices filled the room, no longer contained to the small space near the fire, but spreading outward in a way that reached the door itself. It was not long before that sound carried beyond it. I noticed the first pause from outside when the door opened again. Another had come, drawn not by invitation, not by notice, but by the simple fact that something was happening within the room that could not be ignored. He stepped in, looking first at the group, then at the cups, then at me. "What is this?" he asked. "They call it chocolate," one of the gentlemen answered for me, raising his cup slightly. That was all it took. He stayed, then another, and another. The room began to fill in a way I had only imagined before, though never this quickly, never with this kind of energy. The fire held steady at the center of it all, the warmth reaching every corner, while the sound of conversation rose and settled in waves that carried through the space without pause. Outside, the snowstorm had fully taken hold. The street had disappeared beneath it, the stone no longer visible where it had once been, replaced by a smooth, uninterrupted layer that softened everything it touched. The world beyond the windows had become quiet, almost still, the falling snow catching the last of the light and holding it in place. It looked like something out of a dream. Inside, the opposite had taken shape. The room had become full, not crowded, but alive, filled with warmth and movement, with voices that rose and fell without effort, with laughter that came easily, as though the space had always been meant for it. Cups moved from hand to hand. People leaned closer to speak. Strangers spoke as though they had arrived together. And I remained behind the counter, watching it all unfold. Not surprised, not entirely, but aware, in a way I had not been before, that something had begun that would not easily return to what it had been. The chocolate continued to pour, the fire continued to burn, and as the snowstorm settled fully over the city beyond, the chocolate house remained filled long into the night. Eventually, one by one, the carriages began to arrive. At first, I did not notice them beyond the soft shift of sound outside, the faint crunch of wheels against the snow where the street had been buried beneath it. Then the door would open, a servant stepping in just long enough to signal their master, and another of the gentlemen would rise from the fire, finishing the last of his cup before making his way toward the exit. They did not leave all at once. Each departure came with its own pause, its own final glance toward the room, as though they were measuring something they had not expected to find. A few spoke quietly among themselves before stepping out into the storm, their voices carrying just long enough to suggest they would return. That mattered. I continued to pour until the last of them had gone, the rhythm slowing naturally as the room emptied, the space returning gradually to the quiet it had held that morning. The fire remained steady, the warmth lingering in the walls and floor, even as the voices faded and the door closed for the final time. I stood there for a moment after the last carriage had gone, listening. The storm had not lessened. If anything, it had deepened, the snow falling as steadily as it had when the first had entered, covering whatever marks had been left behind and leaving the street untouched once more. It was difficult to believe that so many had come and gone through it, that the same quiet street I now saw had held such movement only moments before. I moved through the room slowly, not out of necessity, but out of habit, setting cups back into place, straightening what had shifted, letting the space settle into itself again. There was no rush to it, no sense of needing to prepare for anything more that night. The work had been done, and more than that, it had been received. I banked the coals carefully, drawing the heat inward so it would hold through the night, the glow settling into a steady center as the fire quieted. It was the same process I had followed countless times before, though it felt different now, not because the work had changed, but because the day had. I had expected uncertainty, perhaps even disappointment. Instead, the room had filled, not by chance, but by curiosity, by a word carried through the street in a way I could not have planned for. The storm I had thought would keep people away had done the opposite. It had gathered them, drawn them inward, turned the warmth of the fire and the strangeness of the drink into something worth seeking out, something worth speaking about. I stepped to the door once more and opened it briefly, looking out onto the street as the snow continued to fall. It had changed everything. The noise of the city had been softened, the usual distractions set aside, leaving only what was directly before them. A warm room, a new experience, something to be shared rather than passed by. I closed the door, turned back inside, and for the first time since I had begun this idea, I felt certain of it, not as a possibility, but as something real. I made my way up the stairs to the loft above the shop, the warmth rising with me as it always had, though it seemed to carry more weight now, more presence than before. The space above remained unchanged, simple and familiar, a place of rest rather than work, and I moved through it without thought. I sat for a moment before lying down, the quiet of the night settling in around me as the sound of the storm carried faintly through the walls. It had been an unexpected success. More than that, it had been the beginning of something I could not yet fully see. I closed my eyes and listened to the steady fall of snow beyond the shop, the same sound that had greeted me that morning, though now it held something different within it. Not uncertainty, not doubt, but confirmation. And as the storm continued through the night, I allowed myself, for the first time, to rest, knowing that when the doors opened again, they would not remain empty.